just hold tight for a sec. I'm going to talk you through a couple just sort of overview things, and then I'm going to give you some information. It's not going to be painful, I promise. It'll be relatively straightforward. And then the work that we have to do today is not difficult, but there's a lot of steps to it. Each step is easy, but what I want to do is make sure you have just a quick overview of what we're doing. Then I'll talk you through the steps, and then as you start doing the work, I will help you individually. So ideally, what will happen is that you'll have in your head kind of a big picture of what's going to go on, and then as you finish up a step, if you don't remember or can't figure out what the next one is, you'll know that you can ask me. What we're working on, what we're doing is we're kind of weaving two things together. One is just general stuff about soil, and soil is pretty cool. So far what we've looked at is soil texture. Today we're going to look at soil moisture and soil pH and something else called nutrients. We'll look at all three of those things in a kind of real cursory way, but it's cool stuff. And then starting on Thursday, we're going to be looking at soil organisms, but that'll take a few days for us to investigate. And that's what we're learning about soil. While we do that, we're also setting up this investigation, which has to do with things decomposing in soil. And it turns out that all of that stuff ties together. Where it ties together is the organisms. Soil organisms are doing the decomposing. So what that means is all that other stuff that we're looking at, the texture, the water holding capacity, the pH, and the nutrients, our big concern is how does that help support the soil organism? If all that stuff is good and we've got lots of soil organisms, we should see a decent amount of decomposition going on. And if not, then we might not see a lot of decomposition at the end of our study. What we're going to do today, so I'll go through this just super quickly and then in a little bit more detail, but to investigate the water holding capacity, what we need to do is we need to figure out the weight of our dry soil. And then we need to get it really, really wet, and we need to figure out the weight of the wet soil. And it's the difference between the two of those with a little bit of math that's going to tell us the water holding capacity. So part of what we're going to do today is just get soil masses and then get this, work on getting soil just the right amount of moisture and stuff. But it's a little tricky because the soil won't really absorb moisture when it's real dry like this unless it's been broken up. So one of the things that we're going to have to do is grind it up. We've got the little mortar and pestles, and we'll just be back there grinding soil, which is actually really fun, as Natalia can attest to. It's fun, right? Yes. And then when we do that, because we're gonna get the soil wet, we're gonna end up with a little bit of extra water. And that water, we don't want to get rid of it because we're gonna test that water for pH. We have pH strips. Really easy process. Once you've tested the water for pH, we're going to use that information to think about nutrient availability. So we're going to get a whole bunch of data today in a whole bunch of little, relatively easy steps. And then part of what we're going to do is start filling out data forms. And normally I would have you all make your own. And we did that yesterday, and you did a great job. But because Canvas was down, you couldn't turn them in. So what I did is I just made one for everybody, and I photocopied it. So if you had one that you really like, you should be proud of your work. But let's just use this one because it's got everything we need on there. So after you've gotten your data, then you're going to fill out the data forms with all the information we have so far, including the stuff that you collect today. And then that's going to get turned in for a progress check. And then after that, I'm going to have you make a materials list. And here's the thing about the materials list. It's not for a grade. It's so that I can make sure that when you show up on Thursday, we have everything that you need. If you don't give me a materials list and then you come in and you're like, where's my bark mulch? I didn't get any. I I won't have any. So it's really important that you give me, by the end of the period, a little sheet of paper, with a list of things on there. And if I have what you need, awesome. If I don't, and you are gonna provide it, and like we both agree that you are gonna remember, that's awesome too. If it turns out that it's something that you don't have and I don't have, probably we'll pick something different, unless you are just like bound and determined to use that particular material.
Well, I was just going to ask if you could bring in your own.
Yeah. Okay, so that's the overview, and then there should be a little bit of time at the end of class, and we'll do some cleanup. You all have been doing a really good job of cleaning when I give you time, and as a result, like, things are not awful. My goal today would be I think we'll have time to actually get some stuff put away, which would be really nice. So we'll see if we get there or not. Okay, that's the overview. Does anybody have any questions about that? Okay, next up is a very short, as I said, discussion about soil pH, nutrients, and water holding capacity, which is what we're going to be that's the data that we're going to be collecting today. And I'll walk you through it, and those of you who haven't been through this drill before, or if you don't remember, what I do is if I underline it, it means you should be writing it down. So everybody should have something to write with and something to write on, and then if I underline something, you put it in your notes. And this is all really straightforward stuff. So there's nothing here that's going to be really complicated that you're going to need to think deeply about. And some of it's probably stuff that at least a few of you already know. So we'll start with soil pH, and everybody here has heard of pH. Even if you don't remember, you've heard of it before. What soil pH tells us is something called acidity or alkalinity. Sometimes we call that basicity. And some of you are like, oh yeah, sure, we know about acids and bases or whatever, but there's some details there about what those things actually are chemically. And as it turns out, for our purposes, we don't really need to know. So here's the piece that you do need to know. That essentially tells us one way in which soils can be chemically reactive. Both acids and bases are pretty reactive chemically. So as it turns out, a lot of things work best when it's not too acidic or not too basic. And we measure it kind of weirdly. So what we're looking at with soil pH has to do with how chemically reactive the soil is. We measure it using this scale from 0 to 14. But 7 is in the middle, because the reactive part is either when things get really acidic or when things get really the opposite of acidic, which is basic or alkaline. And so, as you can probably expect, in general, what we would sort of tend to see in areas where there are healthy populations of plants and other organisms is that they'd be sort of in the middle. So most plants kind of prefer soils that are between 6 and 7.5 on that scale. And remember, that's the middle, and the middle is where it's least reactive. It's extreme at the edges, not so reactive in the middle. So plants and other organisms prefer generally to be growing in soil that's sort of in that middle ground. And remember I said that with this study, our decomposition study, what's really key is the soil organisms. And so what's most important for us is that when we get real low on that pH scale or real high on that pH scale, it can affect the things living in the soil. So extreme pH levels can negatively affect soil organisms, and that is kind of a big deal. We need those soil organisms to do that work of decomposition. They are not just in the soil, they are literally part of the soil. Soil organisms are part of the definition of what soil is. So we gotta have them in order to have soil. And then the next piece here, you can see it says extreme pH levels can negatively affect soil organisms and nutrient availability. And that's kind of important too, so we'll talk about that next. And the nutrient availability, some of you know what nutrients are, and those of you who don't, you've heard of it. Okay, so this is not, again, something that's going to be super brand new to most of you. And basically, what nutrients are chemicals that plants or other organisms need. We need nutrients as well. But in our diet, we think about nutrients as things like the proteins that we eat, or some of the stuff that might show up in vitamins. Those are all nutrients. But essentially what a nutrient is it's a little chemical that living organisms need to live. So plants need nutrients just like every other living organism. This is a list of some of the nutrients that plants need, but not all of them. We don't really need to know that much about most of them, but there are 3 that we're going to focus on. These tend to be the ones that soil scientists and people who are like farmers, people who do agriculture are most concerned about, and those are phosphorus, nitrogen, and potassium. If you've taken biology or like honors bio or AP bio or something, you might remember phosphorus is really important because it's in DNA, and it's also in a little thing called ATP, which is a really important energy molecule for cells. Nitrogen is in DNA, and it's also in proteins. And potassium is something that your cells use as an engine. Basically, what happens with potassium is cells move it around, and then they let it flow back where it was, and when it flows back where it was, it does stuff that's really important to a cell. So cells basically make little reservoirs of potassium, and then they let it come out of the reservoir, just like water out of a dam. And just like water out of a dam, it can do stuff in a cell when that happens. So one of the things that is kind of interesting is that when soils are too acidic or too basic or alkaline, then the nutrients can sort of get stuck. So there's a connection between pH and the availability of nutrients. They might be in the soil either way, but if there's too much acid in the soil or too much base in the soil, then those nutrients get stuck. They get locked up because the soil sort of reacts with them. The acidic part of the soil or the basic part of the soil reacts with those nutrients, and it locks them up, and then plants can't use them as easily. So what we're going to do today is check and see if the nutrients that are in our soil are available, which is a really important thing to think about. And then the other piece is, well, are they there at all? And it turns out that soil nutrient levels are most closely associated with soil organisms, which again we'll look at more on Thursday and into next week. And the way it works is that the soil organisms literally eat stuff in the soil, organic material in the soil, like the things we're putting in for our experiment, and then in a variety of ways, including literally pooping, they produce nutrients. So earthworms, for example, what they do all day long is eat organic material in the soil along with soil particles themselves. They tunnel around and they just eat whatever is there, including rocks, not rocks, but mineral particles, clay and silt and sand. And in there are all sorts of organic materials, little tiny pieces of wood or leaves or, plant roots or dead bugs or whatever. And they eat it and then they poop. And their poop is probably the best thing you can imagine for soil. Earthworm poop is the best. It's so good for soil for a whole bunch of reasons. And one of the reasons is because it's full of nutrients that plants can use. And the other soil organisms that we're looking at do the same thing. All right? So we're going to be focused on these 3 nutrients: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So when you take your soil pH today, you can come back to this table in the slideshow that's on Canvas, and you can kind of check and see, like if it ends up being like an 8, then most of those are pretty available. Phosphorus is a little kind of constrained, but nitrogen and potassium are pretty available. If the soil comes back and it's like 4.5, then maybe some of those nutrients aren't going to be as available as they would be if the pH were different. The last thing that we're going to talk about, which is actually the first thing you're going to look at, is water holding capacity. And there's a lot of ways that we can look at water in the soil. One of the things that's important is just like how much water is there. And most of you probably noticed when we went out and got our soil the other day, there wasn't a lot of water, right? Like it was pretty dry out there. Hopefully we get a little bit of rain between now and Thursday to put some water in the soil, because we'll see more soil organisms if we do that. And then another thing we can look at with water is, instead of looking at how much water is in the soil, we can ask how much water could the soil hold? Like if it was completely full of water, had all the water it could hang on to, then how much would it be? And that's called soil water holding capacity. It tells us how much water the soil can hold on to. We usually express it as a percentage, which means what we're really saying is, what percent of the dry weight of the soil can it hold in water? It's kind of a weird thing to say. You don't really need to understand that part of it, but we're going to be doing that calculation today. So soil water holding capacity, the way we figure it out, and we'll do this today, is we just put as much water as we can put into the soil, and once it starts dripping out, then it can't hold on to any more. Soil sticks to water, or more accurately, water sticks to soil like magnets. So it's kind of like if you pour water in soil, it sticks to the soil. And you pour more, it sticks to the soil. You keep pouring it until it's full, and then water starts dripping out, and that's when you've reached the capacity. And we know some stuff about water holding capacity and how it relates to other properties of the soil. So for example, clay soils retain more water because they're small and sticky. And that small stickiness means that they can hang on to more water. And you don't need to know the details of it. It has to do with electrostatic charges, actually. It has to do with it is like magnets. Water sticks to soil because of something very similar to magnetism. Sandy soils, on the other hand, tend to drain quickly. And if you've ever been to the beach and kind of played around, you know that that's true. Like if you pour water into sand, it just goes right through. And those of you who have had any adventures out on our sports fields know that the clay soils retain more water. That's why, it can be dry for a month, and then it rains, and immediately the fields are a mud pit because they just hang on to all that water. It doesn't go down and move out of the field. It just stays right in the soil, right up at the top. And then another thing that can help with soil moisture and soil water holding capacity is organic matter. So when we put our stuff in the soil, which we'll do on Thursday, we're putting stuff in there it's called organic material. It's going to be like cardboard or paper or leaves or branches. And in soil, that stuff gets broken down by the soil organisms into much, much, much smaller pieces of organic stuff that's called organic matter. And that organic matter, we can't tell what it was. It just, like in soil, it just kind of looks dark. But we don't know whether it was a branch or a leaf or a piece of paper or whatever that was decomposed. But it turns out that stuff can hold on to water too. And if you mix organic material in with soil, they work really well together to hang on to water. And why do we care? Because plants and soil organisms both need water. So the higher the soil water holding capacity, the more water you have for plants and soil organisms. The problem is that clay soil is the stuff that really hangs on to water, and there's some downsides to clay soil. So it turns out usually what works best for soil organisms is something that's not too much clay. You want some in there to hang onto the water, but you don't want too much because it kind of creates some difficulties in some other areas, right? So that is the information that you'll need to know. And what I want you to think about, and this is kind of how the class is going to be structured from here on out, there's always going to be this sort of two-tiered system. On one side, we're going to be talking about thoughts and ideas and concepts and words and vocabulary and processes. And that's stuff that you're going to think about and you're going to have in your notebook, and I'm going to test you on that stuff. You'll be able to use a note sheet, but the more you understand and if you can write stuff down, the more documentation you have, the better off you'll be. And then there's the stuff that we do, and those are really skills. So learning about water holding capacity is great. I also want you to be able to measure water holding capacity, which is a skill. And that's something that I'm gonna test you on as well. So think about the plants, right? Like, you needed to know the names. That was something you did with your brain. But then you also needed to be able to identify plant specimens. That was a skill. So what we've done so far with soil is learn about texture, and you measured it. And now we're going to learn about soil water holding capacity and soil pH and soil nutrient availability, and you're also going to measure it. So here's what those measurements are going to look like. And I'm going to walk you through it reasonably quickly, because the instructions will be up here, and I don't think you're going to be able to remember all the instructions, and you certainly aren't going to have time to write everything down. But I want you to have at least a visual of how this is all going to unfold. So as I mentioned before, it's going to start with getting your soil samples. I've already taken them out of the drying oven, so they're just set to the side. Those Petri dishes are pretty fragile, and they get, like, when they've been in the oven, they get real dry, and so when you touch them, your hands will get real dry, and sometimes they slip. So when you're carrying the Petri dishes, carry them like this. Don't try to hold them like this, because they might just slip right out of your hand. So you'll have a Petri dish with a bunch of soil in it. You'll take the soil, and you're going to grind it up with the mortar and pestle. So put it in here, and then grind. And this, I promise you, is super therapeutic. Those of you who have been having a bad day will find that your mood improves by grinding soil, because it just feels great to break big things into little things. Once you've done that, then you're going to take that soil and you're going to pour it back into your Petri dish. And then you're going to find its weight. You're going to find the weight in the Petri dish. So it says right here, find the mass of your dry soil in the Petri dish and report it in your notes. So you take your scale. This is not a scale, but there's scales back there. You put the Petri dish on it with the soil in it, write that number down in your notes. Okay. The next thing we need to do is get that soil really wet. So what I'm gonna recommend is there's all sorts of containers back there, and it's probably easiest if you use 2 containers to do this. So I would say one of those containers can be a beaker like this, a glass beaker, and the other can just be, there's like plastic cups, or you could even use another beaker for it. And what you're gonna do is take one of these coffee filters. If we run out, I can get some more. And you're gonna put it in the beaker, and you can push it all the way down, that's fine. And then you pour your soil in there. And then you're gonna add some water to your pouring vessel, whatever you choose to use, and you're just gonna pour it in slowly. And because this soil is so dry, and you will have ground it up so small, what you might find is that you might need to just kind of stir it around a little bit to get the water to absorb. But ultimately it'll absorb, and then you'll start to see some water trickle out through the bottom. Okay?
So just to confirm, do we
Yeah.
put the dirt into the beaker first with the coffee filter on top, or do
Nope.
we put the dirt in the coffee filter?
You put the dirt in the coffee filter, okay? And then, so then you'll pour that water in and get it nice and wet. And then, when you pull the coffee filter out, you'll have some water in the bottom that came through your soil. Don't get rid of that. We're gonna use that for the pH. You take your soil in the filter and kind of like drip dry so that it's like not dripping water anymore. And then that water goes back, what did I do with my sample? That goes back in the Petri dish. And what you're gonna discover is that you can't get it all out of the filter, and that's fine. Just do the best you can. There will be some left in the filter. So then you have the Petri dish full of wet soil, and you're gonna put that on the mass as well. And so you find the mass of the wet soil in the Petri dish, yoink, and then that goes in your notes. At that point, you're done with the soil. So you can put it in, there's a white bin back there that's just full of the leftover soil. You can get the soil out of your Petri dish. You can even rinse it out and then dry it off. And then we need one more weight measurement, and that is the mass of the empty Petri dish. So you're gonna have 3 measurements of weight, of mass. One of those is gonna be the Petri dish with the dry soil. One of those is gonna be the Petri dish with the wet soil. And one of them is just gonna be the Petri dish. Cameron, will you stop please? So here's what you're gonna do with that. This is a mathematical formula. I'll put it up here. It's in Canvas as well. And I can remind you if you need help, remember it. Here's the formula. You take the soil, sorry, that's not what I meant to say. You take the dry soil in the dish, so the mass of the dry soil in that Petri dish, and except that's still not what I meant to say. I'm so sorry. Hold tight. I'm like brain back online. You take the mass of the wet soil in the Petri dish, and you subtract the mass of the dry soil in the Petri dish. What that's going to give you, and you don't need to understand this, but some of you like to know this stuff, that's going to tell you how much water was in the soil, the mass of the water. It's going to subtract out the soil, it's going to subtract out the Petri dish, and the only thing left would be the mass of the water. And then you're going to divide that by the mass of the dry soil in the Petri dish minus the empty dish. And what that's going to tell you is the mass of the dry soil alone. This whole thing is going to get multiplied by 100, and that will tell you the water holding capacity and it'll be a percentage. It's telling us the percent of water that we have per gram of dry soil, effectively. And it should be pretty high. Our soils are going to hang on to a lot of water, so it might be 70, 60, it might even be more. Some of them can be more than 100. You can have more than 100%. Yeah?
And you'll do this 5 different times a week.
Your group is going to do this 5 times. Yeah, because you have like 4 or 5 samples. Each one of you individually has your own sample, right? Okay. So that's data point number 1, water holding capacity. Data point number 2 is the soil pH. So that's right here. And for that, you're going to need that extra water that dripped out of your soil. And you're going to take one of these. I'll keep them up here until you're ready, but they're just really easy to use. You take this little strip and you dip it into the water, pull it out real quick, and it'll start changing color right away. And you just hold it up to the side of the container and match it with a color and write down whatever number that is. That's your soil pH. That's data point number 2. Data point number 3, you'll come back to this slide and line up your pH with the availability of these first 3 nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And if it turns out that everything is really available, then you can just say highly available. If it turns out that some of them are a little bit lower, then you might say medium. If they're all real low in availability, then you would say low. So just a high, medium, and low for nutrient availability. And that is the data that you're going to collect today. Once you've gotten all that data, then come on up and get a data sheet. And you and each member of your group need to complete the data sheet with everything we've gotten so far for all of your samples. So there's spots on the data sheet for all 5 of your samples, and when you look at the blanks, you'll see it goes in order: the location, the texture, water holding capacity, pH, and nutrient availability. Then there's some more stuff, and the more stuff has to do with soil organisms and decomposition, but we're not there yet, so you don't have to worry about that.
Does each group member need their own?
Yeah, you'll all get your own, and you'll all fill them all the way out. And then, as we get closer to the end of the class period, I'll tell you how I want you to turn those in, okay? So that'll be the starting point. That's gonna take most of the class. And then when that's done, we'll move on to turning that in and then making a materials list for your decomposition study, and then as much classroom cleanup as we have time for. All right, yeah. Yeah, so I'm gonna wait for just a sec. Does anybody have any questions? Okay, so yeah, now is